everyone says, I think, history repeats itself. And I think the one thing that we can be certain of about history is that it never repeats itself, despite the fact that we say that all the time. Let me give you one example, which is probably the example that's most used about different things that are going on in the United States of America. People will say, fall of the Roman Empire. You've all heard that. You may have said it yourself. But that usually relates to the fact that the Romans had too many parties. And that's not why Rome fell. It existed for 12 centuries before it fell, and it fell for two reasons: taxation and immigration. What was the matter with their taxation? It was utterly unjust. The poor and the lower rungs of the middle class paid taxes. The rich pretended to pay taxes. Now, does that sound something like us? Maybe, but theirs was far, far more entrenched than anything that we have. In fact, the tax collectors were people who were assigned to that job from birth, and they couldn't get out of it. And if they couldn't collect enough taxes in their district, they had to pay what was missing. So needless to say, they didn't really care how they did it. It was a completely different system. It was unjust, just as ours is unjust, but it was a lot more unjust. Immigration. You know about the hordes of barbarians who came in and destroyed the Roman Empire. They were basically immigrants. They were the Germanic tribes that wanted in. They wanted to be Romans. They realized that the Romans had it much better than they did. They were on the wrong side of the river and they wanted to come across. They were basically immigrants. Did the Romans call them immigrants? No, they called them barbarians. Where did they get that from? They got that from the Greeks. The Greeks came up with the idea of barbarians because as far as the Greeks were concerned, if you couldn't speak Greek, you were nobody. And when they heard people speaking in other tongues, to them it sounded like bar, 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 like we would say blah, 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 blah. And that's where the word barbarian comes from. So are we afraid of immigrants also? You bet we are. But we're not as afraid as the Romans were. The Romans had no way of bringing those people in. Why? Because the Romans were utterly inflexible. Are we inflexible? Yes. Are we as inflexible as the Romans? No. It's very unlikely that we will end up in the same situation as the Romans. We may fall, but it will be for other reasons. Why are we different? Why are we not exactly like the Romans? The answer to that was really given last night by Doug. The answer is the Jews. We are not like the Romans because of the Jews, which may sound like a completely insane thing to say, but it's true. There are really two great rivers that influence our culture and influence the ideas of everybody in this room, whether they want to be influenced or not. And those two great rivers are the Greco-Roman and the Judeo-Christian. The really important part of each of those constructs is the first part. What was important about the Greco-Roman comes from the Greeks and was passed on to us by the Romans. What's really important about the Judeo-Christian is the Judeo part, the Jewish part, which was passed on to us by Christianity. Let's go back to the very beginnings of the idea of history repeating itself. Where did this come from? This idea, which just isn't true, that history repeats itself. It goes back to prehistory. The earliest human societies, in trying to arrive at meaning, which we all have to do, we all have to construct meaning. even if we decide that the meaning is that it's meaningless. We all have to do that. We have to find a way of saying, well, what is this about anyway? Who am I? Who are we? What is this? Where am I? Everyone has to answer those questions. Every early society that we know about, and we know this not from writing because they couldn't write, we know about it from objects that they left behind, largely architecture. We know that what they did was they looked up at the night sky, which was the most extraordinary phenomenon in their world. Not in ours, we've blotted it out with our own lights. But you can imagine what it was like in the times when there were very few human beings on the earth and there was no electricity. We had barely learned to cope with the idea of using fire. At night, the dream time, we looked up at the sky and we saw that it moved. And we saw that it was patterned. And we saw that those patterns came back again over the course of a year. What was that? It was the gods speaking to us. What else could it possibly be? And in every early language, the word star and God is the same word. These heavenly beings told us about our lives, told us what was going on earth. What did we see in the great drama of the sky? The sort of cosmic version of our own little drama. So it was extremely important to be able to interpret what was up there. And that's how we get the figures in the zodiac. What star are you? What are you born under? What are you? We're still saying things like that. It goes all the way back to the earliest human beings. They may have had different languages. They may have had slightly different ways of talking about these things, but they were all talking about the same thing. What was the ultimate lesson of the sky? The ultimate lesson of the sky was that it gave us in large what we experienced in small here on earth. What did we experience? Summer, fall, winter, spring. Summer, fall, winter, spring. Birth, copulation, death. Birth, copulation, death. Over and over again. This was the great drama. Who were we? We were basically like sheaves of wheat. We were here one day and we were cut down the next, and we were followed by another generation, which in its turn would grow to maturity and then die. That was the lesson of the stars. That was it. So what could I do about this? Well, I could learn what was going to happen in the future by looking at the past, or by looking at the stars, which was doing the same thing. Which is why the very first architecture of any consequence in the world, outside of domestic architecture to keep people from freezing to death or burning to death, was basically a kind of cosmic sky map, calendar, planetarium. That's what Stonehenge is. That's what we find in many other places. There's a barrow in Ireland called Newgrange. That isn't what the people who built it called it. We have no idea what they called it. And on December 21st, the interior of the barrow is filled with light. It's the only day on which it happens. All right, that's a form of Stonehenge. It looks different, but it's still doing the same kind of thing. And you find things like that all through the world. These sky map calendars The lesson for the whole ancient world was that what has been will be. That life is predictable and it's ruled by fate. And even at its most sophisticated, that was the lesson. And that was the lesson that the Greeks taught. They taught it to themselves and they taught it to the Romans. And if you look at a Greek temple, you see that the whole purpose of it is to remove unpredictability, to remove surprise. The left is totally balanced by the right. It's placid. It enables you to enter it and to come into a kind of peace with your own absolutely necessary fate. We will all die. It's what happens in Siddhartha when Siddhartha sits by the river and comes to a kind of oasis of peace over and tranquility over the fact that he will cease to exist. That is the lesson of the ancient world, whether it's Stonehenge or the Parthenon. And with the Greeks, we get it at its most sophisticated, in its most sophisticated form. Is there anything against this? Because we don't really believe this anymore. I mean, some of us may in some way or another, but it's certainly not what our civilization believes. Yes, the difference starts with the beginnings of the Judeo-Christian stream. It starts really in the story of Abraham in Genesis. What's different about that story from these other stories and these other insights and worldviews? What's different is that in the Greek view, time is not real. There's no such thing as time in our sense. Time is simply a wheel that keeps reappearing. Abraham is told by God to set out into the unknown. What's going to happen to him? He has no idea. He is asked to walk out into the unknown, to the unpredictable. He is asked to embrace something that is to come to be, to embrace the new. The only thing that's real about the future in this prehistoric Jewish view is that the future hasn't happened yet. That's what's real about it. It really hasn't happened yet. It never happened before. It smashes the wheel and it gives you a completely new view of the universe. That's our view of the universe. We believe that the future is real, that it hasn't happened yet, and that we create it in the present. So you get, in the story of Abraham, a completely new idea of time that is completely antithetical to every other ancient view. You also get, for the first time, the idea of individuality. Abraham has a vocation, a personal destiny. He is not just another sheaf of wheat that will soon be cut down. Something's going to happen to him that never happened to anybody before. He is unique. He is a unique individual. So you get two things that are absolutely essential to our world: real time and real individuality. In all the ancient plays and dramas of the Greeks and earlier peoples, the characters are types. They are not individuals, not the way Abraham is. They do not have personal destinies. So you get a completely new thing. What do we end up with at the end of all of this? Because I can see soon I'm going to run out of time, and I'm only halfway through. The Greeks gave us the filing system of the Western world. They gave us our categories. If you go through a university, all of the departments have Greek names: philosophy, psychology, economics. These are all Greek words. They gave us our filing system. They gave us our categories. What did the Jews give us? They gave us our value system. And the basis of our value system is this intertwined set of ideas about time and individuality. There's also another idea in there that's sort of fugitive. And that's the idea of justice. If Abraham is an individual, then so is Sarah, in some sense. So are you. So am I. Which is, in seed, the beginning of the idea of social justice. We are very, very good at time and individuality. We are not very good at social justice. So two of the ideas have really taken off, and one of them has really limped. I was going to read to you a little passage from one of my books, Mysteries of the Middle Ages, but I won't do that now. I'll just mention what I had in mind to say, which is that whereas the Greek temple is the very image of predictability, the Gothic Cathedral is the very image of unpredictability. The whole idea of the Gothic Cathedral is surprise. What can possibly surprise you? It's not balanced. Look at the two spires of Chartres. One is completely different from the other. Did that bother the people who built it? No. They thought it made it more fun. Everything is a little out of balance. The whole cathedral looks like it's about to take off instead of being rooted on the earth. So whereas with the Greek temple, you get time spatialized, in the Gothic cathedral, you get space temporalized, made into time. I would just finish by saying something about justice, the fugitive value. We look back on the people of ancient times, the people who built Stonehenge, and realize that they engaged in human sacrifice, that people of that period even offered their own children to their gods to get a better result. We see that in passages in the Hebrew Bible related to the god Moloch. Canaanites actually offered children to Moloch. And this sort of thing is not unusual. It happens all through the world if you go back far enough. We look at that and we say, my God, how hideous. How could anyone have ever done such a thing? We look back as far as the 18th century and we see public executions taking place in a supposedly civilized country like England, where people would come out with their children and a basket lunch to watch a public hanging. What was the point of watching that? Watching the guy's neck break. That was the height of the drama. And we look at that and we say, that's horrible. How could you have done that? How could you have brought children to that? How could you have passed out sandwiches while that was happening? I think that in the not too distant future, people will look back on the United States and say, how did you execute teenagers when you knew perfectly well that the only people you were executing were the poor? When you knew perfectly well that 1 in 8 of them at least was innocent? How could you have done? So you did it out of the way where nobody was looking. You didn't bring your children to see it. Does that make it less cruel? On Sunday, I happened to be in Washington, D.C., and the front page of the Washington Post had a photograph such as I've never seen before. It's of the birth of a baby who's in the foreground, little head toward the camera, and a woman lying on a bed looking at her newborn child. The woman died 15 minutes later from loss of blood. That happens in Sierra Leone to 1 in 8 birthing mothers. 1 in 8. Whereas in the United States, it's 1 in 4,800. And in Ireland, which has the best record in the world, it's 1 in 48,000. Sierra Leone, 1 in 8. I believe that if we survive as a society, and that is dependent upon all of us and the choices we make in the present, that is certainly what the writer of the story of Abraham would say. If we survive, we will look back on a picture like this and say to ourselves, how could we have let this happen? Thank you very much.